Hello, welcome back. This afternoon, we have a very exciting discussion ahead of us, and that is the conflict between science and religion. This, of course, has long been a point of contention since the rise of the modern era. And then, depending on how quickly we get through that, we'll end with a discussion on the nature of truth. But if this video goes a little too long, I'll probably stop it short and record that on its own. So, obviously, I don't think, maybe not obviously, but I don't suspect there's a lot of confusion about what this issue is. So it has long been this idea, which, as we're going to find out, is not, it's an invention of the modern era. But there's long been this idea that science somehow disproves religion or religious claims. And that science is somehow a greater reality or truth about the world than, say, religion can provide, or even philosophy can provide. Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, particularly in the case of the first two, very respected scientists and intellects, have said philosophy has nothing to teach us. Everything we know we can learn from science, and anything we don't know, someday science will reveal to us. Well, I think for my money, the biggest problem I have with that is that they're wrong. I shouldn't say it that way. No, but I have some pretty strong disagreements. One, and this is going to bridge over into today's lecture, is what we talked about when we talked about God as aseity, as perfect being, as being from itself. The classical theist notion of the transcendent God. We'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But I also have a problem with that because I think it fundamentally misunderstands the kind of discipline that science is and the kind of discipline that philosophy and theology are. Kinds of discipline. Now, I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a scientist. I do not work on any specific kind of science. I like science. I think science is a great deal of fun, particularly because it gives me science fiction, without which I would not be truly happy. But I'm not claiming to know anything particular about atoms or cells or planets. But there's a difference between making a statement in science and making a statement about science. And as a philosopher and theologian, and we'll see exactly what I'm talking about, there are things that can be said about science without being a scientist. So, the first thing to recognize is that science has a history. Okay? First of all, the word science comes from a Latin term, scientia, which really means like a discipline of knowledge. So they talked about all kinds of different sciences. They talked about the science of logic, the science of grammar, the science of music. And of course, they did not mean what we mean by it today. This is important to know about all kinds of terms. There's so many things that we just assume about the world that are honestly very, very recent developments in human thought. And that doesn't make them wrong or bad or false. But it is something to take into account. History has a lot to teach us about the way we have thought and the way we do think. And so this scientia, as we would think of it, what we think of as science, they would have probably called natural philosophy. And I'm not talking about just like the medievals or the ancients. I'm not just talking about Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. I'm talking about people like Sir Isaac Newton called what he did philosophy, natural philosophy. Leibniz, same. These people, when they were originally doing science, these people that put down together Copernicus and Galileo, when they figured out what they were doing, or when they were telling people what they were doing, they categorized it not as science as we think of it, but as natural philosophy. It's not until the 19th century And a lot of it has to do with what was going on in Germany and with the universities there. But it's not until the 19th century that we start using science as a community in the West in the way that we mean it now. And even then, it wasn't agreed what counts as a science and what doesn't. There's a lot of agreement now, but there's still some gray area. This is seen in the distinction between what is called the soft sciences and the hard sciences. You know, biology is a hard science, whereas psychology is a soft science. It's kind of a science, but not exactly. Sociology is a soft science. It uses empirical data, but it's not quite the same as astrophysics. So it has a history, and it hasn't always existed the way we think of it. So one of the things that we need to recognize is that there was a crisis of epistemology at the end of the Renaissance that we now think of as a watershed moment in human thought. And that is the rise of what's been called the Enlightenment. So the way science is done now, and the way we think about it, is it really began in philosophy. So René Descartes famously said, "Cogito ergo sum," which is, if you don't know, the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." And what Descartes was after was a way of validating our thoughts so that we could have certain knowledge. Not like certain knowledge like a certain kind of knowledge, but certain knowledge in terms of certitude. And so he developed this philosophy that started to try to understand the world in terms of its parts. Newton's going to take this up, and that's when we're going to get the mechanistic philosophy that is also key to his mechanics, which, you know, for the longest time was the paradigm for thinking about physics. And then Kant and reason, roughly the same time, is taking these ideas and putting them in this notion of pure reason. And on the other hand, you have these natural philosophers who are kind of taking this, and they're getting deeper and deeper into their knowledge. They become very clerical. This is the rise of the encyclopedia. People just cataloging information and information and information such that the books start overflowing. And then it is in this moment, in the 19th century, that this crystallizes into a notion of science. Now, there's this idea that, well, science has just been growing. It's just been aggregating since its inception after we got rid of all those silly things the ancients and medievals thought. Well, that's not the case. The thing is that science, too, has revolutions. You might read the book by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a fabulous work that looks at the history of science. The science does not just keep growing and growing and growing in data. It has revolutions where it rejects things that were considered to be obvious before and accepts things different from the way they were. We see these moments in the development of quantum mechanics or theory of relativity, when Newton's mechanistic philosophy or Newton's mechanics was no longer seen to be a good enough explanation for the way that the celestial or space realm works. And so that theory was no longer used. And it's not like the data wasn't there, it's that the data started pointing to something different. Science changes, it evolves. It's not just the case. This is often not understood, though. And this comes out of a mistake that's made when talking about science, which is the assumption that science itself is a worldview. I find this particularly interesting in the way we even use the word science. You know, so you hear people say, well, science tells us, or according to science. What does that mean? You know, like, what are we doing when we use that word? We're talking about it like it's a person, you know, like, yeah, I ran into science the other day. She's doing great. She's got a couple of kids. You know, that's not what science is. Science is a realm of disciplines. And so I think part of the problem is people think science is itself a worldview, a philosophy of sorts. It's not. A scientific worldview is possible, but science itself doesn't make value judgments about the world. Science is a method of inquiry that is based solely on empirical data, the observation of empirical data, and accepts no explanation for the cause and effect and the various forms of development in empirical reality that has a metaphysical cause. So what science does is it says we're going to look at the physical world, we're going to judge it simply by the physical world. That's a method. Scientism is a worldview, similar to materialism or naturalism, which is what a lot of scientists believe. That is that there is nothing, there's no metaphysical, all that we have is the physical world, and science and the physical world is the only way we can know truth. This is also called materialism. Not like materialism in the terms of, I'm a material girl and this is a material world, but rather materialism that matter is all that exists, matter and energy. There is no super physical reality. There's no ghosts, there's no demons, there's no God. What this physical material world, that's all that exists. Naturalism, the same way. That only things that exist in nature exist. There's nothing behind the curtain. Scientism is a similar kind of view in that the only thing we can know for sure is what is proved by science. But again, this is a crucial distinction. Science is not telling us what to believe. It is a worldview, a philosophy that takes what science produces as a method of inquiry that tells us what to believe. Similar to history. History can tell us that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, but history can't tell us why that matters for the career of Julius Caesar and how it had its enormous effect on the future and the destiny of Rome. So science can only tell us empirical realities. And this can really chafe some scientists. You might even be in the sciences, you might have a professor in the sciences who would think everything I'm saying is a bunch of bunk. And I'm honestly fine with that because I'm a philosopher and people say that stuff about us all the time. But I do want to submit to you that it's different to talk about science as a discipline and a method than it is to talk about it as a worldview. Science isn't a worldview. Science is a way of doing things. And science, as a method, depends upon philosophy and worldviews. Science has philosophical presuppositions that science cannot itself demonstrate. For example, that we can know things. Science can't prove that. Science has to assume that in order for any of it to get off the ground. Science has to assume that our reasoning or our senses are basically trustworthy, or that, the world is ordered. That's not something science can prove, because those are not empirical ideas. They're not empirically falsifiable notions. Ideas are not physical. And the idea that science is the only way we can know truth is not a scientific fact. It's not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement. It doesn't. There's no way for science to falsify it. And that is the problem. And the other thing about an idea is it's not physical, and so we can't know it through the methods of science. An idea is not something that you can take and toss around the court. You don't pick an idea up from the movies. You don't cut an idea up and feed it to the pigeons and the ducks at the park. Ideas are not material realities. They are something that exists in our mind. And this is why what science tells us can form and should form in very crucial ways our worldviews. But it is a category mistake to think science is itself a worldview, any more than, say, psychology is a worldview. History is a worldview. Biology itself is a worldview. No, these are disciplines that aid us in our understanding of a worldview, and they have presuppositions that are philosophical and cannot be demonstrated by their own methods. Science cannot demonstrate that an idea is true. Science can have empirical data which gives rise to why an idea explains, but does not actually explain why it is the case. Science can't do that. Science can't make a value judgment. Science can't tell you, for example, whether or not you should get married, or if an act was wrong or right. Science can't tell you what you should do about your obsessive-compulsive disorder, or whether it's a good idea for you to pursue collegiate education. Science can't do that because empirical data doesn't do that. Empirical data provides the basis upon which we make those decisions. It does not make those decisions because science cannot give value judgments. And so Nietzsche, we've talked about him before, remember he is quite the atheist, but he also had a lot of incredulity the way that people were talking about science, and he was living in the 19th century at the time when a lot of these notions about science were starting to arise. And he said, critiquing them, specifically talking about music, so you can see up in the right corner, that's a piece from Beethoven's Pathétique, one of my favorite pieces. But Nietzsche says, okay, we now know that music is sound waves moving through a gaseous sphere. Whoop-de-doo. We have only described more precisely what music does. We have not said what music is. And so Nietzsche concludes, we are better at describing things, but no better at explaining them. You can cut down the Pathétique sonata of Beethoven into all of its exact mathematical proportions, but you can't say from that activity why it's beautiful. That's not the kind of judgment that math or science can make. Science could maybe tell us, or math could maybe tell us something about why we find patterns and harmony and order beautiful, because it's pleasing, but it can't tell us why that's the case. And so, in a similar sense, religion isn't exactly a worldview either. Religion is itself a method for approaching reality. Okay? It's a way of thinking about, check the time here, it's a way of thinking about the world, a way of approaching the world, a way of interpreting the world. But it's not itself a worldview. And so, in a sense, if we were to speak very generally, we could say that science asks how. How do these things happen? But religion is about value. Religion asks why. Why is it this way? Yes, we know that that certain chemicals fire in the brain when someone is angry or sad or in love, but we can't say why. So this would be a very good reading for the Meditations in the Tool Shed. If we've reduced love to a bunch of chemicals firing in the brain, and thus do not believe in love, well, where do we get off thinking that it wasn't the same exact kind of chemicals firing our brain to make us make a scientific judgment like that? The problem doesn't go away just because you've said words like chemical and brain. The experience is the same. And so, it is important when we're talking about religion and science to not see them, even though many people would make us would have us believe this, they're not opposed. They're two different ways of engaging the world. And for my money, because I love that science fiction, you know I love that science fiction, for my money, I think science and religion go together quite well. So, in conclusion, I would like to submit to you that before we get off on this notion that science disproves God, as if a method of inquiry that only takes into account material empirical reality could disprove a non-empirical, non-material reality, is a bit of a stretch, to say the least. You can't look out the window and not see God and thus say God does not exist. God is not a material reality. And so, science has been given a little bit more credibility in areas that it's not quite capable of proving, even by its own methods. On the other hand, it is essential to how we live our lives and provides even the possibility for us to be having this discussion online. And so it's not that science is bad. It's that people are misusing what it really is. Similarly to religion, religion isn't bad because people use it to go out in crazy holy wars and kill people, holy wars and kill people. No, that's a bad use of religion. It's a bad value judgment. It's a bad moral act. Similarly, to try to make science something that disproves religion is a bad science act. It's not good science. And so, in the end, science and religion, I do not think have to be opposed. In fact, I think that they can be quite comfortable together. Okay, that's it from me. I will be looking forward to the discussions we're going to have. I'll probably do one more short video on the truth and the nature of truth question. And then also, I'm going to do a lecture, probably a longer lecture. I would say definitely half an hour. But I'll do another lecture that you don't have to watch, but if you want to talk about the problem of the existence of God, I'll do a lecture on that. And you can look at that if you like. Okay, well, I hope you're having a great week, and I will see you next time here in Theological Foundations for a Christian Worldview.